Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2024 Minnesota Book Awards finalists in the competitive novel and short story category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota and the novel and short story category through the generosity of the Minnesota Humanities Center. My name is Kurt Johnson, co-author with my daughter Ellie of The Barrens, which won the 2023 Minnesota Book Award. As we get started, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, indigenous keepers of the land on which most of us on this panel recording are participating from today. This land was reserved for the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow indigenous inhabitants of this land. The Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of story in this place now called Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, honor this tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we all work together to lift up storytellers in our state. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by Vivi Ganeshananthan, author of Brotherless Night, published by Random House, Penguin Random House. Mona Susan Power, author of A Council of Dolls, published by Mariner Books, HarperCollins Publishers. Will Weaver, author of Power and Light, published by Calumet Editions. Benjamin Percy, author of Sky Vault, published by William Morrow, HarperCollins Publishers. Congratulations to each of you for the MNBA finalist nod. I've been in your position and know how exciting it is. In interest of making the most of our short time together, I'm going to begin with a round robin question that I'd like each of you to respond to in turn. I'll then have questions specific to each of you and your wonderful finalist book. And here is the round robin question. My novel, The Barrens, started with a simple idea right after my daughter came off a 500-mile river canoe trip through a remote Canadian wilderness. 2 go in and 1 dies. What was a simple idea or spark that led to writing your novels, assuming there was one, and did it develop into an outline or expand organically as you wrote sentence after sentence? And Vivi, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Kurt, for moderating this conversation. As you said, I publish as Vivi Ganeshananthan, but most people call me Sugi, and I hope you'll feel free to do that too. And thanks so much to everyone tuning into this. So this question is so interesting. And I think like you, I had an image or a journey kind of in mind. I was doing a bit of research for my first novel and came across the story of a hunger strike that takes place at a temple in 1987 in northern Sri Lanka. And the hunger striker was a young Tamil militant from the ethnic Tamil minority, a member of the Tamil Tigers. And that fast really captured my imagination and interest because the way that people told that story varied so greatly. Some people viewed him as a martyr, and some people viewed him as someone who had been manipulated. So I was very interested in his story, and I knew that it did not belong in my first novel. So I started writing about that hunger strike, and I realized I couldn't write about it from the point of view of the hunger striker, or at least I didn't want to. And then I began writing about it from the point of view of a young woman who is also Tamil, who is a childhood friend of his, who is a medical student, and she's observing the hunger strike from the stage. So it was her voice that kind of began the novel. And the question that you've asked so generously presumes such conscious organization. I love it. Anyway, so I did not have an outline, or then I did have an outline. Then it became clear that the outline existed for no reason except to be chucked out the window. And so I suppose that my process was somewhere in between the two things that you describe. I had an outline, and then fortunately was encouraged by various people and found in myself also the ability to leave it when I needed to, which was great good luck. And it turned into that young woman's story, actually. And the fast does appear in the book.
Great. Next, Ben Percy.
Well, I'm here to talk about the Sky Vault, but it's hard to talk about this one novel without talking about the larger Comet cycle. And I've been writing for Marvel or for DC Comics for 10 years now. And as much fun as it is to write about characters like Wolverine or Batman or the Teen Titans, I'm very aware that they don't belong to me. I'm merely their custodian. So I wanted to create my own sandbox, my own universe, I guess you could say. And the trigger event for this universe was a comet, an age-old sci-fi concept. A comet comes streaking through the solar system, and our planet spins through the debris field, and new elements are introduced to the world. Elements that shake up the energy in the weapons sector, elements that upend the laws of physics and geology and biology, elements that create, in a very Marvel DC way, a new dawn of heroes and villains. And so all of these books take place simultaneously, more or less, in different parts of the world. So the Sky Vault is the story that culminates this first trilogy, even though this could be, a series that goes on for 6 or 8 or 10 books or however many. Right now, this ends the current cycle of stories. So I wanted to have things come to a satisfactory conclusion for these 3 novels, but also open the door to more trouble. And so the thing that triggered this particular story in the cycle was my grandfather's involvement in World War II, for one, in that he was stationed in Alaska. And when I was up there, I've been up to Alaska a few times now, but when I was up there, I saw a few things that sparked some ideas. One was when I was fishing outside of Seward, I came across this spire of rock with a fortress at the top, an old bunker at the top, the kind of bunker that my grandfather was stationed in as he guarded the coastline from a potential incursion. And the other thing that started to trigger ideas was I came across outside of Fairbanks all of these atmospheric science labs that rose out of these black spruce forests and looked like something out of Stranger Things. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about what everybody is thinking about these days, which is Oppenheimer, which just won a Best Picture award. And as an alt history scenario, I wondered what if there wasn't just that lab at Los Alamos with Oppenheimer in charge of it? What if there was another atomic laboratory going on simultaneously? And so I have a group of scientists who are trying to not figure out how to split the atom, but instead how to spin the atom at such an accelerated rate that they might create a rift in time-space to create what we oftentimes think of as wormholes, which in science fiction stories are the way, you get those ships from one side of the galaxy to another. Right. And I thought, what a gift this would be during wartime. What a great tool this would be to somebody like MacArthur in figuring out how to march an army from one side of the world to the other in an instant, or even roll a bomb through. And so all of these things kind of converged in my brain, and I started to think of that scenario in the past coming together with a current day storyline.
Great. Mona, I'd like to hear from you.
Well, first, let me just say thank you so much for the wonderful question that came up with. And I'm really honored to be sharing this platform with these terrific writers. And thank you for those of you who are tuning in to hear us talk about our writing process. So for me, I'm going to be really honest. I needed some money. This was back in 2019. And so I decided to write a short story for the Missouri Review contest. I'd been a finalist in a previous year, and their top prize is $5,000. So that really motivated me to start working on a new story. And so I was sitting there with notebook in hand, ready to write. And what flashed into my imagination was an image of myself as a child growing up in Chicago in the 1960s, a little girl who absolutely adores her mother, even though she can be dangerously unpredictable, lashing out in sudden rages. And so as I began writing my way into that story, there were many false starts. I kept crossing things out, but things really began cooking when I wrote about a specific memory from childhood when I first heard the news of Richard Speck killing 8 student nurses in our city. I was 4 years old at the time. This was in 1966. And what made such an impression on me was learning that one of the nurses was able to survive by hiding underneath a bed. So I stored that away as a future strategy in times of danger. And then Ethel, a tiny Thumbelina doll that I'd carried with me everywhere when I was a kid, showed up in that scene unexpectedly, and I was off and running. And I didn't consider turning this story into a novel until about a year later, when a really dear writer friend of mine, she read this story and she said, you know, this could become an entire novel. And by this time, I didn't win the Missouri Review a short story contest. It was an honorable mention, so they did publish it, and that's how my friend read it. So I started thinking about turning this into a novel, and at first I thought I would just expand the short story, staying in that one era of the 1960s. But as I was working with that story, I realized that the mother character comes off somewhat unfavorably, and I didn't want her to be judged. So I thought, you know, why don't I show her as a child what she went through? And that's how I began to develop an idea of structure. I never outline. I wish I did. I'm not that organized. My process is really pretty organic, and I just sort of grope my way along.
Okay, great. Will, what was the spark? And are you an outliner or an organic writer?
Well, thank you for that question. Hi, everybody. I haven't met our final four, as we could call it, during March Madness season. I look forward to seeing you all at the Ordway. I am not a real outliner either, but I'll speak to that in a moment. The genesis for my novel, Power and Light, was an injustice deeply embedded in my family. I always knew about it. I knew that something had happened to one of my great aunts. It was never spoken of, but whatever it was, it truly had turned her life around and backward. She became the aunt who never came, who stayed upstairs, and eventually, a little later on, I realized that it had to have been some kind of sexual crime against her, and it came out that it was by a quote unquote powerful man in the community. So I didn't come back to this story until many, many years later, and she had certainly passed by then. But the matter of injustice just would never go away. And I don't think we can fully apply justice retroactively, but at least we can try. And so Power and Light is sort of unpacking of what might have happened to her back in the 1930s when she was a young woman, and that ripple effect through the generations in my family. That story is still out there, and that injustice still exists, it seems to me. For the epigraph of my novel, I use a quote from Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who says, "Justice is like a train that is nearly always late." And that was a real driver for me to finish that story. And not through an outline, but rather a little trick that I employ. And any one of us, I know there are writers, emerging writers probably watching this eventually. how to stay organized. How do we stay organized in our narrative? I was just looking through Moby Dick, Melville's Moby Dick, the other day, and I remembered what he does, and Dickens and some of the old writers did this as well. They named their chapters. And in Moby Dick, there's a chapter early on called, for example, All Aboard. All right, well, we know what's going on there. We're boarding the Ahab. There's a chapter even called Chowder. Well, what a great and beautiful thing to see, both as a writer and a reader. We know that chapter is going to be all about chowder. And it really helps us from going off in so many different directions. So I usually name my chapters as they go along. And by stringing those names together, sometimes you can get a skeleton outline of the novel.
Great, I love it. Okay, we're going to move on to questions for 2 questions each for each of the authors. We'll start with Sugi. You choose a first-person narrator, Sashi, who is mostly in the moment, but sometimes offers a glance into the future. For me, that memoirish glance created a sense of control and anticipation. Tell us about how you came to develop that narrator.
Thanks so much for the question. So I spoke a little bit about this earlier. The young woman, Sashi, who is observing that hunger strike that takes place in northern Sri Lanka in 1987. When I continued to develop her voice, she seemed to present herself rather insistently in first-person retrospection. So the story is told from the point of view of New York in 2009. It has a prologue, and then it's her recalling her mid-teenage years and about the decade after that. So the first decade of the Sri Lankan Civil War. And yeah, it's retrospection. So it was interesting because one of the things that she does, in addition to glancing into the future or wondering how the past might have been different, is that she also directly addresses the reader. And that I think is a key part of her voice and character. And that was something that my subconscious, I guess, delivered to me. And then various people who were reading early drafts said, oh, that's so interesting. Keep going with that. And so that became a refrain throughout the novel. And I suspect that my fondness for first-person retrospection, as one of my creative writing classmates said to me years ago, he was sort of like, you love the retrospection. And I was like, well, I love regret. I just love to think about, how did I screw all of these things up and what could I have done differently? And I suspect that, that aspect of my personality has made its way into her voice, because I think fundamentally she's asking herself the question of how all of these things could have been different and how her family might not have had to endure the things that they did, and where might she herself have made different choices. If you were going to trace back, I think at one point she refers to it as a fuse. If you were going to trace back the fuse, where would it actually start? So I think that, for me, I think retrospection is probably fundamentally connected to a tendency to look back and wonder what other paths were not taken. And she was a great vehicle to do that.
Right. To me, Sri Lanka and the plight of the Tamil Tigers was more than just a setting. The historical component seemed to drive the story. Can you talk about that and what the Civil War and the fight for independence meant to you?
Sure. So Sri Lanka has an ethnic majority, the Sinhalese, and it has several different ethnic minority communities, the largest of which is Tamil. And within the Tamil community, there are several different communities there. So there are upcountry Tamil, the upcountry Tamil community, which is probably best known for working, coming and working on tea plantations. And then there's a community in Jaffna, which is where Brotherless Night is set. And all of these communities are porous and intermixed. And there's a Muslim community that is politically distinctive. And so I was trying to be as inclusive as I could without tokenizing any community. And I did know that I wanted to set the story in Jaffna. I wanted it to be centered on civilians. The story of the Thummel Tigers have sometimes been presented as a feminist organization, in part because very famously they had a women's wing. And so very often when the story of Thummel women in the Sri Lankan Civil War is told, it's told in a militarized way through a woman cotter. And it was my feeling that both that wasn't the experience of most Thummel women. Most Thummel women were trying to take care of their families at home or not at home if they were displaced. And yeah, just that the story of kind of someone who was in a militarized setting with the Tigers had been told, and I think should be told, but had been told by others who were better positioned to do that really than I was, and who were probably more interested in that. The stories that I grew up with were largely stories of displacement and being civilians who were in a place that was being bombarded, and like a setting where there's civil society and it's increasingly becoming militarized. So and I think that I also wanted to depict, there's often kind of a simple narrative of ethnic majority that controls the government versus the largest minority and the Tigers representing that minority. But the Tigers declared themselves the sole representatives of the Thummel community. They were not elected, and they persecuted many Thummel people, and they also had rivals. There were other Thummel militant groups. So I wanted to portray that complexity as well and show that there were among Thummel civilians dissidents who were critical of the state, who were critical of the Tigers, who were critical of Indian peacekeeping forces that were there during that period and that committed atrocities. People who were, that it was possible to be critical of all of those actors, and then also like the international community, and what does that even mean? So it is very much a historical component driving the story, but also maybe a version of history that some actors had tried quite intentionally to erase or obscure, that I was attempting to return to the center of the canvas, to kind of take those stories that had been marginalized, like Thummel critics of the Tigers, or people who were criticizing the Tigers, but maybe also were actively critiquing the state and who were trying to make space for complex political conversations in a time of essentially like rising authoritarianism and fascism. And I found that the more that I wrote about that, the more I kind of looked out the window and was like, hey, look at that. That feels so familiar. So I was both dismayed and intrigued by the historical parallels that so often presented themselves as I tried to write about civilians, and their attempts to maintain civilian space.
Sure. Mona, I'll move on to you. Your writing style feels lyrical and effortless. What part of your writing is actually effortless, like driving a car and making coffee, like muscle memory? And what part feels like a calculus math test?
Well, thank you so much for that incredible compliment. I really appreciate that. What's hilarious to me is I don't actually drive because I'm too anxious. I don't drink coffee, but I totally, of course, understand what you're asking. So there are times when I have a voice come to me so clearly, I can run with it for maybe a page without stopping. But more often I write in a real stop and start fashion, where I'll write a sentence and then I'll read it aloud to listen to the rhythm of the words, the rhythm of the sentence. And I check for my overuse of gerunds. I'm gerund happy, or too much repetition when it comes to language choice. I use the online thesaurus constantly. And then I'll record the day's output. I'll read it aloud and record it and listen to the voice, jotting down notes for future edits. I really want my work to read as smoothly as possible. And I think performing it is always important to me because I come from a theater background. And and the rhythm of language is so important to me because as a kid, I wrote poems and I loved poetry and I would memorize a lot of poems. I liked the dramatic, tragic ones like The Wreck of the Hesperus. And so I was addicted to rhythm, but I really am more of a storyteller. So that's why I moved on into fiction. But yeah, language is just so important to me. And so I'm glad that you could sort of, or I'm glad that the effort didn't show. All
Sure.
that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the hard part in writing, is to make it look effortless. Uh, Part of being a novelist is to develop empathy skills. And I think it takes deep empathy to understand the generational trauma you described. Which character was closest to home and which forced you to stretch your empathy skills?
Well, thank you again, Pidama Yaye, for your kind words about the book or the writing of it. So from earliest memory, my mother always called me her sponge. She noted how I was always picking up on the feelings and thoughts and moods of other people. Even as a toddler, if there was someone sitting in a corner, sort of apart from everyone else at a social gathering, I'd, toddle over to them and pat them on the hand and sort of, I was kind of like a caretaker, caretaking people's moods. And so even though I was painfully shy, I would do this sort of thing. And I was pretty sweet as a little kid, looking after people. I could be a handful now, but I had this sweetness. I really cared about folks so much. And so I've actually had to work hard to build boundaries. Because I pick up and absorb so much of what's floating around out there. Almost to empathy to it can be dangerous sometimes. Sending me to the hospital when I'm picking up on all the stress that's out there. I'm just bombarded by folks' feelings and tensions. And so in terms of who I identify with the most, it's definitely the Sissy/Jessie character, because we see her again later when she grows up. Although I made Jessie much more successful than I've ever been. And I wasn't writing autobiography by any means. Though definitely this work is inspired by my life, things that happened to me, and by things that happened in my family going back generations. But I made some choices early on that helped me make the leap into the realm of imagination so I could move past the actual events. But Sissy's era is my era, growing up in Chicago in the 1960s. And a lot of the issues that she struggles with have been my issues as well. The character was most difficult for me to work with at times was because there are three generations. There's Sissy, and then there's her mother's generation, Lillian, and her grandmother, Cora's generation. And Lillian, Sissy's mother, was definitely the more challenging character for me to work with when she's a grown-up. In the same ways that my own mother, as much as I adored her, could be a lot to navigate safely. And so I was sympathizing very heavily with the little girl character in that section. However, once I was working with the Lillian character as a child, then it was absolutely easy to feel for her and have just my heart so open to her and what she's going through. And that's really why I decided, as I alluded to earlier, to make this a multi-generational story. I didn't want any of these parental figures like Lillian, and later we get to know her father, Jack, who can be dangerous at times. I didn't want people judging them. Not that people should be excused their bad behavior by any means, but just life is difficult, and these folks have been through an awful lot. They're survivors, surviving the best they can, loving the best they can. And so I wanted people to have compassion for them, a little bit more understanding for them. And so that's also why I decided to structure the book the way I did. So moving backward in time. So we would meet a families, step into their situation, and there might be a parent where kind of wishing the kid could get away from that parent, and then in the next section you see that parent as a child. So now your feelings about them become more complex, and
Right.
hopefully there's more compassion for them, because if there was going to be a villain in the piece, I wanted the villain to be colonization. And I wanted to bring forward the story of the Indian boarding school experience, which haunted my family. My mother and her siblings went to these Indian boarding schools, and both of my grandparents on my mother's side went to the infamous Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which set the template for other such schools that sprouted up all throughout Canada and this country. And I wanted to bring to the fore, show people how much, that the past isn't in the past. It's still impacting us today. So even though I never went to an Indian boarding school, I was feeling the effects of that really awful system, because it impacted my family and earlier generations. So.
Wow, great. Will, you're up next. Your writing style throughout Power and Light is unadorned and concise, brief descriptions, get to the point dialogue, and short chapters. For me, this craft created stronger story momentum. Was that the point? And please expound.
Well, thank you for that question and that insight, because momentum is almost everything if we think about it. But going back to the matter of prose, as Mona said, it takes a lot of work to get that lyrical prose. And I'm the first to say that I do not have naturally curly prose, if there is such a thing. I always defer to trying to capture that emotional, that psychological moment, the moment of tension, as opposed to any flourishes of literary kind of sentences. That's not to say when the situation arises that I won't take advantage of a moment to let loose and have some real extended sentences and metaphors. But in terms of prose style, one of my goals is to have what George Orwell called window pane prose. That is to say, prose that is like a clear glass that you can look through without blemish, without impediment, and see directly into the unfolding story ahead. And a part of that window pane prose goal is to give the reader zero excuse to stop reading. And if you think about it, there's an unending number of excuses that we can give them by going on too long, we're joking about gerunds, okay, maybe passive voice, and all manner of clunkiness that we have to, through revision, I think, refine out of our writing. The matter of flow, the matter of the sound quality, it's already come up in our discussion. The last test for my writing is for me to read it to myself aloud. And we can hear those sentences that need work. So flow and momentum is just absolutely super important to me, probably one of the top priorities. I had a reader pop up the other day and said something that was just the best comment ever. She said, I started Power and Light at 8 o'clock in the evening and I finished at 3 o'clock in the morning. I said, okay, now that's the kind of comment we like. And one other reviewer out of the blue, I was peeking on Amazon, as we sometimes do with our reviews, and he said simply, Power and Light read like silk. Okay, now that's good writing itself. That's a good sentence. So that's kind of what I aspire to, smooth flowing prose with a great deal of forward momentum.
Great. There's a lot of research that goes into writing historical novels to make sure you get the details right. However, in fiction, there are cases for writing necessary exceptions to fact to better serve the story, especially regarding trains in Power and Light. Can you talk more about this and your research process?
Yes, again, Power and Light is set, as I mentioned, in the 1930 is a 5-year period there. So technically we could call it a historical novel, but I think we should maybe put a finer point on that definition. I was thinking about that. Historical novels seem to me seize on an important historical moment, a coronation, a new queen, a successful sea voyage, a battle, and then wrap their characters around that historical moment. Versus literary novels, I think like Power and Light, that use history as it comes along. If it works, I'll use it. In the 1930s, the Depression era gave me a lot of rich possibilities to use it if it worked. For example, FDR coming through the upper Midwest, North Dakota, giving a speech in Grand Forks, North Dakota, about the WPA administration's successes. Yes, my character can go to that. I can use that scene. But as you mentioned, trains in particular, and I make a note of this in my author's acknowledgments, that trains were operating and running, certainly in the 30s in the upper Midwest, but I employed them more fulsomely than was probably the actual case. And I said, I think in my author's note, forgive me, I love trains and my characters needed them.
Yeah, that's great. These are the two questions for Ben Percy. Many of my characters have their genesis in someone I've known or met. My favorite character in your book is Littlehead. Now, this is a two-part question. What are your thoughts on character development to bring them alive? And the second part is, did you know somebody with a little head?
This character is based in part on someone I grew up with, yes. And his body was fully formed. He was actually a really oversized teenager that I went to school with and was friends with. And yet he had, because of some cancer when he was younger, an undeveloped head, but his brain was magnificent and he had great wit and attitude. And so he's stayed with me all these years, and I wanted to find a space for him in a story. So it's, not an exact replication of him,
Sure.
but a kind of cousin to him. And, he has something in common with all of the other characters in this story, is that they're sort of in a state of in-betweenness. I've got one character named Rolf who is facing retirement and feeling an inadequacy. I've got another character who's a teenager and he's gone through this sudden growth spurt. So he's like a little boy in a giant body. I've got a woman who has inherited a construction company that's on the verge of bankruptcy, and she's not trusted by many that she's trying to work with. And they're all striving for relevance. But in many ways, this book is sort of like a book of time travel. I mentioned before that it takes place in the past and in the present, but all these characters feel a little bit wobbly just in general, and that they don't feel like they've ended up where they ought to end up. Their history and their future doesn't seem to line up. And that character that you mentioned, Littlehead, he's another embodiment of this theme, in that he's sort of in two places at once, the past and the future, and that his body doesn't actually match up. And he looks like a young boy and he looks like a man at the same time.
Your characters are very three-dimensional, though, and are there any craft tricks that you have to bring them alive?
Well, just in general, my books can be very plotty, very suspenseful, but I don't think that anybody cares how incredible your time travel device is, or how scary your squid aliens are, or how awesome your, ninja train is, or whatever. Like, nobody cares about any of that stuff unless there's a beating heart at the center of your story. And so I always try to think character first. and to really, give them soulfulness. And part of that is how I plan for writing a novel, and that I have, a scroll of paper up on the wall, sometimes 2-3 years in advance of actually hitting the keyboard. And on this scroll of paper, in addition to plot points, what I'm doing is building up a kind of Wikipedia entry on all the characters. I'm even drawing them, cartooning them. And once I figure out who they are fully, who I'm able to figure out like what they want. And it's only when you figure out what they want that you're able to effectively put obstacles in the way of that desire.
Sure.
Like a cruel God. And that's where the plot comes from, in response to character.
Sure. This is your second question, because the first one was a two-parter. But the second question is, part of what you do is create a believable idea, for example, the portable black hole. You take the reader past the thought of, that's just too damn crazy, to, well, just maybe. So what's that trick to get somebody to believe something that really is unbelievable?
I'm going to approach this question as a professor, as I once was, and that at first my approach to teaching was, there aren't, I'm not going to put any fences around you. Write what you want. And in part that was because I was battling against what I had faced as an undergrad myself, in that my professors over and over again told me, no genre, no genre, no genre. So I wanted to be more open-minded, but what I discovered is that some restrictions were required, in part because, they were writing 5-page short stories, but they wanted to build up this entire universe and they just didn't have room for it. And I started to look to people like Karen Russell and Amy Bender and Kevin Brockmeyer. And what I noticed in all of their stories was that they would change one thing. And so that started to become my rule as a professor, is that you can go as crazy as you like, but you change one thing. And what that one thing oftentimes did is it allowed for not just the space of a 5-page or 10-page or 15-page story, but just in a larger sort of sense, so that it applies even to a novel. It's a lot easier to buy in if it is a world that we otherwise know,
Right.
Bread costs the same, gas costs the same, you still drive a gas-powered vehicle and your grass needs cutting and blah, 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 blah. But there's a crack in the mirror. And so in this case, I have a crack in the mirror. I talked before about how every one of these books in the Comet cycle takes place at roughly the same time, but they're all taking place at different parts of the world. And they're also all dealing sort of with one thing, one new element that I'm introducing. So in the case of the Ninth Metal, which takes place in northern Minnesota, that has to deal with omnimetal, this new metal that absorbs energy and stores it in a kinetic reserve. The other book, that An Unfamiliar Garden, takes place on the West Coast and has to do with alien fungus. This book, The Sky Vault, has to do with quantum physics. They all have this sciencey undercurrent to them. And it has to do with quantum physics, and it has to do with, this notions of these portable wormholes, as you called it, the portable black hole. And so that's my crack in the mirror for this book, right? So it's our world, except.
That was great. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
Thanks to our tremendous novel and short story category finalists, and to all of you watching for taking part in this Meeting the Finalists panel. And thanks again to Minnesota Humanities Center for sponsoring the category. If you enjoy this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards steward organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. In particular, mark your calendars for Tuesday, May 7th. That's the evening that the winners in this category and 8 others are finally revealed. Join us in St. Paul at the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. Tickets are just $22, including processing fees. Visit thefriends.org MNBA for details.